Welcome back to Strides to Solutions. I'm Esther Adams. Picture this: you are grooming your horse before a lesson. Your hands are moving, you can feel the brush in your palm, you can feel the warmth of his neck, and you are, by every visible measure, there. But somewhere behind all of that, a budget calculation is quietly running, a work deadline is pressing at the edges, the feed order needs placing, the farrier appointment needs rescheduling, and none of these thoughts are loud enough to interrupt what your hands are doing. They are just there. Quiet, persistent, background noise that happens to be consuming the same cognitive resource your lesson is about to demand. Most writers would describe that experience as being a little distracted. The research describes it as something more specific than that, with a mechanism worth understanding because what is actually happening in that moment has direct consequences for whether the lesson you are about to have becomes lasting improvement or evaporates by Thursday. Today, we are going to talk about working memory, what it is, what scarcity does to it, and why the quality of cognitive presence you bring to a lesson matters as much as the lesson itself. And if you are a trainer or instructor working with adult amateur clients, the second half of this episode reframes something fundamental about why writers who seem to absorb corrections well in a lesson cannot always access them the following week. Alan Baddeley's working memory model, first proposed in the 1970s and refined extensively since, describes working memory not as a simple storage container, but as an active cognitive workspace, the mental environment in which thinking actually happens. It is where you hold what your trainer just said while simultaneously applying it to what the horse is doing underneath you. It is where the plan for this movement meets the feedback from the last one. It is where incoming information from the horse's body connects with everything you already know about how he moves, how he responds, what he needs. For skilled riding, working memory is probably the most continuously demanded cognitive resource in the entire system, and its most important characteristic, the one that decades of research have confirmed beyond reasonable doubt, is that its capacity is genuinely limited. The system can hold and actively process only a small number of meaningful elements at once, somewhere around 3 to 4, depending on complexity. When the number of elements competing for that space exceeds what is available, something degrades. Elements get dropped, encoding into long-term memory weakens, or the system slows as it cycles between things it cannot hold simultaneously. Any of those outcomes has direct consequences for whether a lesson produces durable learning or simply passes through. What Baddeley's model captures that simpler accounts missed is that working memory is not passive storage. It is the active process through which experience becomes learning. When it is compromised, it is not simply that there is less room to hold things, it is that the integration, the bridging between what is happening now and what is already known, that constitutes most of what learning actually involves, becomes slower, shallower, and less reliable. Now, here is where it connects directly to the amateur rider's daily experience. Scarcity, whether of time, money, or energy, depletes working memory not primarily by adding tasks to a list, but by generating a specific kind of background cognitive occupancy that researchers describe as involuntary. The mind with an unresolved scarcity concern does not choose to keep returning to it. The concern has its own attentional gravity. It draws cognitive resources toward itself without permission, particularly when it is unresolved, and it does so through pathways that the brain treats as high priority monitoring, because unresolved resource pressure registers neurologically as something that needs continuous tracking, even when that tracking serves no useful purpose in the current context. Research measuring the cognitive effects of this background occupancy shows decrements in fluid reasoning and executive function comparable to other significant cognitive loads. Neuroimaging studies show that a scarcity mindset increases activation in the brain regions that code for the value of the scarce resource, while simultaneously reducing activation in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the region most directly responsible for goal-directed, deliberative control. In plain terms, the brain under scarcity works harder on the scarcity problem and has less available for everything else. the resource that should be fully available for learning, for error correction, for the fine tuned decision making that skilled riding demands, is being quietly redirected toward a problem the barn cannot solve. For trainers, this is the most important thing to understand about the rider who is technically present in your lesson, but seems to be absorbing less than you would expect. She is not choosing to be elsewhere. A significant portion of her working memory bandwidth is already occupied by the week she just came from, and that occupation is invisible to her as well as to you. The research uses the phrase cognitive bandwidth depletion to describe this state, not cognitive absence, but a measurable reduction in the processing capacity available for the work at hand. She is trying hard with what is genuinely available to her. That deserves to be met with understanding rather than recalibration of expectations about her ability or commitment. Now, here is the distinction in the research that I think matters most for how riders and trainers understand what actually gets learned in a depleted session, and it is specific enough to be genuinely useful. Research on how scarcity affects cognitive control shows that it selectively depletes what researchers call proactive control, the capacity to maintain goal representations in task context in working memory across time, to hold the broader picture while managing the immediate moment. What is largely preserved, even under significant cognitive load, is reactive control, the capacity to detect something in front of you and respond correctly to it. For writing, this distinction maps directly onto a critical difference in what gets learned: reactive learning, responding correctly to the immediate stimulus, the transition your trainer calls for, the fence that presents itself, the correction given in the moment, can proceed reasonably well even when the system is under load. What suffers is something more important for long term development: schema formation, the gradual building of higher level knowledge structures that capture the principles underlying skilled performance, the kind of understanding that allows a rider to adapt a known principle to a new situation rather than waiting to be told what to do. Schemas are built through proactive cognitive processes. They require holding the broader context while responding to immediate events, and they are the architecture through which isolated technical corrections eventually become integrated, transferable skill. The writer who learns repeatedly in a state of depletion may accumulate a repository of technically correct responses without building the schematic understanding that makes those responses deployable independently and flexibly. She executes movements correctly when directed and struggles to self correct when not. She rides well in lessons and feels uncertain when she schools alone. This is not a limitation of ability. It is the predictable consequence of a learning environment that has repeatedly favored reactive over proactive processing because the conditions required for the latter were not fully present. There is a perceptual cost as well, and it is worth naming directly because it operates slowly and invisibly over time. The development of genuine feel, the ability to notice increasingly subtle differences in the horse's movement, balance, and responsiveness, requires broad, soft, receptive attention. It rewards the kind of unhurried perceptual availability that scarcity driven tunneling directly reduces: the subtle shift in back engagement, the marginal change in rhythm, the tension beginning to build 3 strides before it becomes a problem. These signals do not register as urgent. They do not compete successfully with the background cognitive monitoring that scarcity generates. And so they go unnoticed, not because the writer does not care about them, but because the attentional system under pressure has quietly deprioritized anything that is not flagged as immediately critical. Each individual missed signal is small. Accumulated across many rides and many months, the effect on perceptual development is meaningful, and it tends to manifest as a feeling that progress has a ceiling, that something about the riding is not deepening the way it should, that technical correctness is being achieved without the feel that should accompany it. There is also something the research documents about what happens to the character of writing itself under sustained cognitive stress that every writer will recognize. When the prefrontal resources required for flexible, context sensitive engagement are sufficiently depleted, the brain shifts toward habitual control, drawing on cached automatic routines rather than the responsive, creative processing that produces genuine feel. The ride still happens. The movements are broadly correct, but the horse is being managed rather than listened to, and the quality of engagement that most experienced riders identify as the real heart of the craft becomes less available. The rider who notices this and interprets it as a lack of commitment or focus may be misidentifying a stress induced neural shift as a motivational failure. It is not. It is the nervous system doing what nervous systems do under load, conserving resources by delegating to what it already knows. Understanding the mechanism points directly toward what actually helps, and there are three things the research identifies that are worth naming clearly. The first is chunking, the process of compressing multiple elements into a single higher level unit based on learned patterns. A writer who has developed a chunked representation of, say, shoulder in, does not need to simultaneously maintain separate working memory representations of bend, outside rein, weight shift, angle, and impulsion. The chunk holds all of these within a single, more efficient structure. Research shows that chunks free working memory capacity not only for the chunked content, but for concurrent processing of everything else, making the same system effectively more capable without changing its underlying capacity. The practical implication is that deliberately overlearning the foundational vocabulary of the discipline during periods of lower cognitive load, building those chunked representations when full attentional presence is available, creates a kind of cognitive reserve that remains accessible even when scarcity has reduced effective bandwidth. The more of the basic work that lives in efficient, holistic chunks, the more working memory is available for the connective and contextual content that builds genuine understanding. The second is cognitive offloading, the deliberate externalization of cognitive content to reduce internal maintenance demands. Writing down the key understanding from a lesson immediately after it ends, not just what was worked on, but what was understood about why it worked, keeps the schematic information that working memory under depletion would otherwise drop from simply disappearing. Research on cognitive offloading consistently shows that externalization improves the quality of engagement with concurrent tasks by reducing internal maintenance requirements, and that the benefit is largest precisely when cognitive load is highest, which is exactly the condition the depleted amateur most frequently encounters. A training journal, approached not as a record of exercises, but as a record of understanding, functions as a cognitive prosthetic that compensates for the encoding gaps scarcity creates. The third is the structure of the lesson itself, and this is where the research speaks directly to trainers. Multiple simultaneous corrections, complex multi element instructions, and warm up formats that demand novel decision making before the technically demanding work begins all increase what cognitive load researchers call extraneous load, the cognitive demand that comes from the format and organization of instruction rather than from the content itself. Every unit of working memory consumed by extraneous load is unavailable for the actual skill development the lesson is meant to produce. A lesson structured around one clear focal point, with a warm up that reduces novelty and decision making before the complexity begins, with instructions that move toward chunked and holistic cues rather than sequential verbal breakdowns, is not simplifying the teaching. It is designing for the working memory conditions that actually allow learning to consolidate. The correction that lands as a single felt image encodes more durably than the same correction delivered as 5 sequential instructions, not because the writer is less capable of processing the 5 instructions, but because the working memory required to hold and integrate them may not be fully available. For trainers, There is one more thing worth considering about the rider who seems to plateau despite consistent instruction. If she is arriving at lessons regularly in a state of cognitive depletion, the learning that should be accumulating may be accumulating more shallowly than either of you realizes. She is encoding isolated corrections and losing the connective tissue between them. She is responding well to immediate instruction and struggling to build the independent judgment that instruction is supposed to generate over time. Recognizing this pattern for what it is, a structural consequence of learning under load, not a ceiling on ability, changes both the response and the expectation. It argues for protecting the conditions that allow learning to consolidate, for structuring lessons to work with the cognitive state that actually walked in, and for understanding that the rider in front of you is capable of considerably more than her depleted sessions have been able to reveal. The bandwidth is not a metaphor, it is a measurable resource, and what a rider brings to a lesson shapes what the lesson can do as much as anything the trainer offers within it. Everything discussed today is drawn from the research in my new book, The Amateur's Edge: The Psychology of the Amateur Equestrian Brain, available now on Amazon. The link is in the show notes. This book was written for the rider who has wondered why her lessons are not sticking the way they should, and for every trainer who wants to understand the full picture of what their amateur clients are navigating before they ever walk through the barn door. Because the rider who arrives depleted is not arriving with less ability. She is arriving with less of her ability currently accessible, and those are not the same thing at all. I am Esther Adams. This is Strides to Solutions.